Thank you everyone for coming here today. Thank you, Jane, for that nice introduction. My name is James Tanzer. Good afternoon, everyone. It is officially afternoon. Thank you for joining me here today, all of you in person and online. It's very meaningful for me to be here today, as Jane hinted earlier. My very first job at age 16 was as a weekend guide at the Wenham Museum. And 30 years later, I'm a museum educator in Maine. So it's really exciting to come back to the place where I first learned to love history. Thank you to the Wenham Museum for inviting me here to share my research into a Black family who was enslaved in Wenham in the 18th century. And this will be the family of Hazard, Flora, and their son, Hampshire. And this research has been enhanced using an unlikely source, which are account books from the Wenham Museum's permanent collection. This project had roots in the pandemic, as Jane earlier said, and I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me just a moment while I do that. Great. Terrific. Now, just a thumbs up from those of you online. Can you see my screen? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, as I said, this project has its roots in the pandemic. With nowhere to go that first spring, I filled my free time with genealogical research. There we go. In doing so, I stumbled upon the digitized 1788 will of a formerly enslaved Black man named Quash Winchell, who lived in the town of Topsham, Maine, very close to where I live right now. I was immediately fascinated. And using the information contained in Quash's will as a starting point, with careful research, I was able to learn a great deal about his life. And most of my early research into Quash's story was conducted online using digitized records, which was great. And the more I learned about Quash, the more it actually bothered me that he'd been completely forgotten. So after viewing Historic Beverly's online exhibit, Set at Liberty, which chronicles the enslaved community in Beverly, I began to think about Wenham. I began to think about home. I knew people had been enslaved in Wenham in the 1700s. Long ago, I remembered seeing their names in the back of a copy of vital records housed in the museum's Pickering Library. Is it still called the Pickering Library? Pickering Library. So I decided to try to learn about the enslaved community in Wenham the way I'd learned about Quash, using online records. So with travel into Massachusetts completely halted, as you'll remember, in 2020 and 2021, online research was going to be my only option. Now, fortunately, I found that the Wenham town records, the Wenham church records, and Wenham probate records had all been digitized from the 18th century. So I could access them from home, which was a perfect scenario. And I quickly realized that the names of the enslaved in Wenham were everywhere. So as you can see there with the red ring around the top left-hand corner, that's a man named Primus Borgelar, who was enslaved by Mary Q of Wenham. This is his marriage record to a woman named Peggy Autumn. She was from a free woman of color from Hampton Falls. In the middle portion, you're looking at the baptismal records of two little enslaved children, one named Peter and one named Flora. And then to the far left, let me see if I can move these guys out of the way, excuse me. Let's get these guys out of the way. There we go. Okay. So on the far right, you can see a probate record. And that is from Daniel Gott, 1758. And a probate record, after you die, all of your belongings are listed in an inventory. And these are listings of 5 enslaved people who were Daniel Gott's property in 1758. And their names are Sharper, Sip, Grace, another little boy named Caesar, and a little girl named Kate. So from these sources, I was able to compile a database of all those I could find who'd been enslaved in Wenham. And you can see this is just a portion of my database here. I think it's the A's through the C's. And the database allows me to sort information by date, by the name of the enslaved individual, by the name of their enslaver, by any number of different options. And by sorting the data in this database, I was able to see patterns emerge and even trace enslaved families through several generations in Wenham. So once travel restrictions eased in the fall of 2021, I reached out to Jane at the Wenham Museum in search of more 18th century sources to supplement my findings, ones that I could actually see in person, which was really exciting at that point. And Jane told me that the museum was in possession of several 18th century account books that had been owned by the Dodge family of Wenham Neck. And so here's a beautiful map, maybe a little bit hard to see, but it's just a gorgeous map from the late 18th century of Wenham. And to situate those of you who are not familiar with Wenham, Wenham is on the North Shore of Boston, Beverly is to the south of Wenham, and Salem to the south of that. To the north of Wenham used to be Ipswich, used to be the Ipswich hamlet. Today it's Hamilton. To the east is Manchester, and to the west are Topsfield and Danvers. And the portion of the town that these account books that the Wenham Museum held are from Wenham Neck. It's this little section of geography here, kind of a slim geographical section of the town. Now, I knew from the work I'd already done that some of the Dodges in Wenham had held people in bondage since at least 1703, when Richard Dodge deeded two of the people he enslaved, one of whom was named Mingo or Domingo, to his sons. So when I arrived at the museum and had a close look at the account books, I realized they were actually all from the same immediate family. And here's a very simple family tree to show you what I found. One was owned by Lieutenant Richard Dodge, and that was how he pronounced his title, lieutenant, in the old way. I found it in some really interesting receipts. So we'll call him Lieutenant Dodge in the old way. They were British, exactly. That's a good point, Jane, thanks. So one of the books was owned by Lieutenant Richard Dodge, who's over here on the left-hand side. One was by his son, Captain Richard Dodge Jr., and the third was owned by Captain Jacob Dodge, who was the brother to Lieutenant Richard. And as you can see, Lieutenant Richard and Captain Jacob were both grandsons of Richard Dodge, way up here. You can just about see him way up there. And he was the man who in 1703 deeded the people that he enslaved to his sons. Now, based on town records, church records, and probate records, these are the names of some, but likely not all of the people enslaved by these men. So based on all of this, I had really high hopes that the account books would mention at least some of these people. So in the Pickering Library, I decided to start with Lieutenant Dodge's account book. It had a really nice soft cover, nice soft leather cover. It was appealing to me. And I opened it and this is what I found on the first page. Obviously, it took me a while to get used to his handwriting, which as you can see is very small. It's really dense, full of abbreviations and really creative spelling. It was clearly making very economical use of the paper that he had. But at the very bottom of the page, once I got there, for the entries from 1776, I saw a name I recognized from my research, and I've just underlined it there in white on the left-hand side of the page. And the name is Hampshire, H-A-M-S-H-E-I-R. That was how Lieutenant Dodge spelled it. And from my research, I knew that Hampshire was a man enslaved by Lieutenant Dodge. Now, this first page of the account book is part of an account for a man named Joshua Orne, who was a tanner in Wenham and Lieutenant Dodge's son-in-law. Lieutenant Dodge hired out Hampshire to work for Orne and collected payment from Orne for Hampshire's work, which was a common practice among enslavers in New England to hire out people they enslaved and then collect that money from the work that their enslaved did. And here is the labor that Hampshire performed for Joshua Orne, here at the bottom of the page. Hampshire, plowing part of a day, harrowing and hauling dung. Beneath that, we see Hampshire again. Hampshire, 6 days work in tan yard, which makes sense because Orne was a tanner. And then 2 lines down from that, Hampshire is in the middle of the page, Hampshire hauling 2 loads of bark. So I continued to slowly make my way through the account book, and just 2 pages after I first saw Hampshire's name, to my amazement, I encountered the name Hazard. And Hazard, I knew from my research, was Hampshire's father. So finding Hazard was revelatory. Here were 2 generations of a family, enslaved in Wenham by Lieutenant Richard Dodge, appearing in the same account book. And I realized that this account book offered not only an opportunity to understand the kinds of labor enslaved people, specifically men, in 18th century Wenham were compelled to do, but it could also help paint a more complete picture of enslaved families when combined with information from other available sources I'd already been using, so that the town church and the probate records I'd accessed online. So over the course of the past 15 or so months, I've been photographing, indexing, and transcribing Lieutenant Dodge's account book, this first account book of 3, remember? And finally, I've been taking every mention of an enslaved person I found in the book and compiling another database specific to this book. And it's from this research that I'm able to share with you what I've so far learned about the family of Hazard, Flora, and Hampshire, an enslaved family living right here in Wenham in the second half of the 18th century. On November 21st, 1745, Lieutenant Richard Dodge purchased Hazard from Nehemiah Dodge of Ipswich for 37 pounds and 10 shillings. Hazard, a man of about 25 years, may have watched the exchange of signatures and money that transferred him from one owner to the next, and in minutes it was done. Now, though Nehemiah Dodge technically lived in Ipswich, his house and land were actually quite close to Lieutenant Dodge's dwelling house and farm, which was possibly located here when he purchased Hazard. Now, this is Wenham Neck today. Over here, you see my little cursor move. This is Larch Row. And here, down along here, what's called the King's Highway is Dodge's Row. And here, the sort of meandering road is Grapevine Road here. And so Nehemiah Dodge today would live in Hamilton, right? But back then, this part of Ipswich was called the Ipswich Hamlet. It was very close to Wenham. Lieutenant Dodge actually acquired more houses and properties on Wenham Neck as the years go by. So he eventually ended up having land here and then here and here. But at the farm of Lieutenant Dodge, Hampshire became part of a small community of enslaved people, all of whom he probably already knew because Nehemiah Dodge, his former owner, lived so close to his new owner. There was a young man named Abaya, called Abaya by Lieutenant Dodge, who was about 26 years of age, around the same age as Hazard. And Abaya was heavily involved in all aspects of farm labor, and he appears in many entries in Lieutenant Dodge's account book. There was also a man named Manning, who was of mixed race, also enslaved by Lieutenant Dodge at this time. And Manning was actually a newlywed when Hazard joined the household because he just married an enslaved woman named Dinah the year before at the church in Wenham. And in fact, both Abaya and Manning were provisional members of the Wenham church, as each of them had stood before the congregation in 1742 and owned the covenant of the church. And Manning doesn't actually appear in Lieutenant Dodge's account book, and I'm not totally sure why. Flora, the enslaved woman who was to become Hazard's wife and the mother of his children, was already there at the farm as well. And Flora's labor would have been centered in the Dodge's house. So as you can imagine, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, mending, sewing, and helping Mary Dodge, the wife of Lieutenant Richard, care for their 4 young children. Flora is also never mentioned in Lieutenant Dodge's account book, but that doesn't surprise me because he's his interest is focused on the farm, and Flora's domain was the household. Nearby on the farms of Lieutenant Dodge's father and brothers, more people of color were enslaved when Hazard joined the household, and he probably already knew them as well. Their names, Archelaus, Jack, and Sip, all appear in the 1750s accounts in Lieutenant Dodge's account book, so we get to see them as well. Now, according to his accounts, Lieutenant Dodge pursued many business ventures, which is a huge understatement. He had a lot of side hustles, as we would say today. By the mid 1750s, he not only had a farm, he was raising sheep and raising cattle, and a business making and mending a variety of vehicles, wagons, carts, that kind of thing. But he also built houses. He owned a sawmill. He was a surveyor and had an apple orchard and produced his own cider. He hired out his vehicles, his houses, his teams of oxen, his horses, and he hired out the labor of the people he enslaved. Such a wide array of business dealings required pristine bookkeeping, as you can imagine, thus the density of his account book. Lieutenant Dodge's account book entries begin in September 1751. So we actually don't have any specific information about what was happening at the farm labor-wise between the time that Hazard arrives in 1745 and when the accounts begin 6 years later. But other records can fill in some of the blanks. Lieutenant Dodge, as we saw, acquired more property on the neck. So he was getting more land and more property, more houses. In the Dodge household, more children arrived. Sarah in 1746 and Simon in 1749. And during this time, or perhaps even before Hazard's arrival in the household, Hazard and Flora became romantic partners, and some of their children were born on the farm as well. But at the end of May 1751, the order of life at the Wenham Neck farm was upended in a very, very big way. Hazard made a courageous and incredibly dangerous decision to seek his freedom by escape. That he made the gut-wrenching decision to leave Flora and their young children behind only underscores his desperation to get away. Unwilling to lose such a valuable piece of property, Lieutenant Dodge composed a runaway advertisement and sent it to the Boston Postboy newspaper. This advertisement survives, and it provides us with details about Hazard we might never know otherwise. I'm just going to read a little bit of this out loud. It is just a bit hard to read. Ran away from his master, Richard Dodge of Wenham in the county of Essex on Wednesday last. A likely Negro manservant named Hazard of a yellowish complexion, middling stature, about 30 years of age, speaks pretty good English, well set, which means he was strong. Had on when he went away a white cotton and linen shirt, a homespun coat mixed with a cast of blue toe trousers, toe linen trousers, blue worsted stockings, a dark wig, a beaver hat, and a pair of pumps shoes with large silver buckles marked DH. He has a scar across the middle of each of his legs, 2 inches long, cut by an axe. He carried off with him a fine large bay horse, 14 hands high, valued at 200 shillings old tenor. And it goes on from there, obviously. We learn so much from this one advertisement. We learn about Hazard's appearance, his stature, his height, his age, even details like scars on his legs. We also learn that he was apparently dressed to the nines and that he left on one of Lieutenant Dodge's horses. So that, and because it then took 4 days for Lieutenant Dodge to report Hazard missing with the horse, leads me to believe that Lieutenant Dodge approved Hazard's initial departure. So was he delivering something, maybe a letter or money, to one of Lieutenant Dodge's contacts, and then maybe used the opportunity to seek his freedom? We just don't know yet. On June 5th, 1 week later, Lieutenant Dodge placed another ad reporting Hazard's escape, this time omitting the horse, which had presumably been found or returned. And anyway, the horse wasn't an issue anymore. Then 3 months later, so in September 1751, Hazard appears in Lieutenant Dodge's account book, hired by Lieutenant Dodge's brother and father to cut and haul back salt hay from the marsh. So Hazard had returned by that point, but when and how? Now, in the research files of the Pickering Library, I came across a transcribed Salem Gazette article from 1889, suggesting that a folk memory of an enslaved freedom seeker persisted in Wenham Neck into the 19th century. And the author of that article, John W. Curtis, explained that when he was a boy in the mid-1800s in Wenham, he often visited a formerly enslaved woman named Aunt Phyllis, who lived in a cabin near the site of the Dodge Mill on Dodge's Row. Aunt Phyllis recounted many stories of her enslavement in Wenham to young John, but one stood out to him. And he talks about this in the article. I'll show it to you here, and I'll just read it. It related to a certain servant, this story, who, tiring of thraldom, very naturally ran away from abuse and unrecompensed labor. But he was overtaken in Manchester woods and securely bound with pinioned arms to the tailboard of his captor's wagon and compelled with bare feet to trot along the dusty highway at a speed commensurate with that of the steed that homeward drew the conquering master and dragged along the vanquished slave. Arriving at the neck, Wenham Neck, he was severely whipped, sent to his quarters supperless, and otherwise punished. So was this a memory of Hazard passed down through decades by word of mouth? Aunt Phyllis, or Phyllis Freeman, did indeed live in Wenham Neck. She died at the remarkable age of 99 in 1859. She would have been born a decade after Hazard's escape, so she would not have known Hazard herself, probably. She would have been too young, I think. But had she known someone else who had witnessed Hazard's freedom attempt and his return, and one person comes to mind, and that's Hampshire, Hazard's son, who lived in Wenham Neck into the 1770s. Now, Hampshire first appears in the Wenham records with his brother Caesar and other sibling Denai in May 1754, and this is the church record, on the day of their baptism at the Wenham Church. From this record, we learn that their father, Hazard, was no longer part of the Dodge household by this point. As you can see there in the transcription, Hazard is recorded as the servant of John Gott by this point. So he'd been sold from Wenham Neck here all the way John Gott's house, several miles away in the west part of Wenham. As you can see, it's on the other side of Wenham Lake, on the west side of Wenham Lake. And the children, as was custom, remained the property of their mother's enslaver. So the children remained on the Dodge farm at Wenham Neck. Now, based on the account book and the church records, Hazard was probably sold between March 1753 and April 1754, just a 13-month span, somewhere in there. It's unclear what prompted Hazard's sale. He wasn't sold in the first months or even a year after his escape attempt, which suggests this may not have been the immediate cause of his removal. We just don't know what prompted the sale. Now, what must it have felt like for young Hampshire and his siblings to lose the constant presence of their father? And how did Flora cope with the sudden permanent removal of the man she loved? From afar, Hazard tried hard to keep his family united. Following his own baptism and acceptance of the Wenham Church Covenant in April 1754, Hazard then brought his beloved children under the auspices of the church as well, and they were baptized just 1 month later. It was one of the few ways that Hazard could exert his protective influence over his children as an enslaved father. In April 1756, Hampshire, Hazard's son, makes his first appearance in Lieutenant Dodge's account book, and there he is in my transcription of that account is down below. And it marked a turning point in Hampshire's young life. Though Hampshire was probably no more than 10-ish years of age, he was now considered strong enough, skilled enough to be hired out with Lieutenant Dodge's son, Richard Dodge Jr., to plow the land of Rice and Abraham Knowlton. And from then on, hard, unpaid manual labor would dominate Hampshire's life. Now, 1 year later, after this, in June, Hazard and Hampshire's family was touched by an immense tragedy. Flora, Hampshire's mother and Hazard's wife, died, leaving her children, her 3 children, all of them likely just 11 years of age and younger, alone on the Dodge farm. With his father enslaved miles away, Hampshire likely took on the full responsibility of looking after his younger siblings, a terrible burden for an 11-year-old child to bear. The pain and abandonment the children felt at the loss of their mother must have been overwhelming. Despite his mother's death, work did not stop for Hampshire. He was hired out with 38-year-old Baya in 1757 and 1758 to haul various loads with a team of oxen, which was really hard work that required a ton of skill between handling a heavy cart and then driving these massive animals. Baya may have acted as a father figure to Hampshire in the absence of Hazard, teaching him everything he needed to know. And under Baya's tutelage, Hampshire remained safe, even as he began taking responsibility for harder and harder labor. Now, by the fall of 1758, Hazard, Hampshire's father, had found love again. In November of that year, he married Judith, a woman enslaved first by Jerusha Dodge and then by John Dodge. The logistics of maintaining a marriage this time around were far more complicated for the new husband. Judith lived in a completely different household, and Hazard would have had to secure permission from John Gott whenever he wanted to visit his wife. Still, by the following year, Hazard and Judith's first child, a daughter, was born. It's unclear how much agency an enslaved father in New England would have had when it came to naming his children, but it is perhaps significant that the baby girl was given the name Flora at her baptism in September 1759. So the question arises, did Hazard choose the name of his new baby in honor of his first great love, his late wife? Less than a month after this, tragedy again strikes the family. In October 1759, Caesar, second son of Hazard and Flora, still a boy, died on the Dodge farm. Perhaps Hampshire brought the sad news of his brother's death to his father himself. Caught between the death of one child and the birth of another, and with no ability to be fully physically present for either his grieving son, Hampshire, or for his new wife, Judith, and their baby girl, Flora, Hazard must have been in a very, very lonely place. At Wenham Neck, Hampshire was now most likely the only remaining child of Hazard and Flora. Denai, his other sibling, was mentioned only once in the church records and never again anywhere else. They may have perished as an infant or may have been sold away by Lieutenant Dodge, but at the Dodge farm, the relentless push of just unending labor carried on for Hampshire. The year 1759 began a very transitional time on the Dodge farm. Baya was hired out to Stephen Lowe for 7 months from April to November. And to fill the labor shortage on the farm, Lieutenant Dodge brought in help from Jack and Sip, who were men enslaved by his father and brother. Hampshire was recorded in the account book as freighting, hauling items with a team of oxen on his own during this time. So his years of careful training by Baya were put to use at last. Now responsible for the work of a grown man, Hampshire was likely only a young teenager by this point. From 1760 to 1765, so a period of about 5 years, Hampshire was hired out by Lieutenant Dodge only 10 times, which was not a lot. And Baya was only hired out once. And my sense of things is that with Baya growing older, he's in his, I'd say, early 40s by this point, and Hampshire still a teenager. All of their labor was probably directed towards running Lieutenant Dodge's farm and nothing else. It was likely during this time that Hampshire suffered yet another devastating loss, and that was the loss of his father, Hazard. In June of 1761, John Gott, Hazard's enslaver, died. And though he'd been a man of some means, Gott had also acquired a significant amount of debt, which his widow Elizabeth struggled to set in order. Hampshire must have watched these proceedings with a deep sense of dread, as did every enslaved person upon the death of their enslaver, because enslaved people were often sold to pay off the deceased's debts. In the January 1762 inventory of John Gott's estate, Hazard is listed on the last page beneath a litany of livestock. And he shares a line in the accounts with a horse. He's valued at 34 pounds, 13 shillings and 4pence. It's the last time Hazard appears in any Wenham records that I've been able to find. Now, Hampshire, his son, was truly alone. By 1767, Lieutenant Dodge's youngest sons, Simon and Nicholas, were finally old enough and strong enough for them to help around the farm. So Hampshire, now in his early 20s, was hired out once again. In Lieutenant Dodge's accounts from 1767 through 1776, we get a really clear picture of the kinds of labor Hampshire was hired out to do. Most often, Hampshire was set to work hauling or freighting, F-R-A-T-I-N-G, with a variety of livestock, 2 or 4 oxen, sometimes horses. He hauled loads of hay, dung, wood, and rocks regularly. Once he was hired to haul a load of 2,000 bricks, and once he hauled a new tumbrel, a 2-wheeled cart made by Lieutenant Dodge, to the byway for pickup by its new owner. Hampshire was often hired out to work at the marsh, which was likely in Ipswich. At the marsh, he mowed salt hay called thatch. And the salt hay provided bedding and fodder for livestock and was used to bank up against the cellars of houses in the wintertime. And occasionally he was hired to go ditching, which I had to look up, at the marsh, which actually involves digging drainage ditches at the marsh to convert marshland into arable land. So like kind of like what they did for Fenway Park. Now, the seasonal work of producing crops began for Hampshire as soon as the ground was unfrozen, both on the Dodge farm and on the farms of those who, excuse me as I admit this person, those who hired his labor. He dug out rocks, hauled them away, broke ground with teams of oxen, plowed and harrowed the fields, planted and he hoed. By late May, he was mowing the first harvest of hay by hand. And in a good season, hay was harvested twice. And in a really good season, it was harvested 3 times. It provided crucial food, obviously, for livestock during our long winters here. In the late summer and fall, Hampshire pressed cider, and occasionally he processed flax, but not very often. The processing of flax was the kind of job that you gave to older people in the household, sometimes older enslaved people, because you didn't have to do a whole lot of work. You could do it sitting down or just standing in one place. Because Lieutenant Dodge ran a sawmill, and here is a picture of the ruined ruined sawmill on Dodge's Row, which was the Dodge's sawmill. Because Lieutenant Dodge ran this sawmill, Hampshire was often hired to haul neighbors' logs to the mill for processing. And on occasion, he was also hired to work at the mill, which was obviously a dangerous job that required a great deal of skill and precision. One wrong cut meant either a precious piece of lumber was ruined, and it was very expensive, or a debilitating injury to yourself. Hampshire was often also hired out to perform the exhausting task of building stone walls. And this stone wall is just outside the iron rail property on Grapevine Road, which the iron rail house was owned by Lieutenant Dodge's grandfather originally. So from the account book, it appears that digging out rocks and building walls was an absolutely never-ending chore at Wenham Neck, each spring thaw pushing ever more rocks to the surface, as you gardeners know. So consider this, and look at the size of those rocks too. Consider this, when you see a stone wall in Wenham Neck today, and many have survived, but they're much shorter than they used to be. Whenever you see a stone wall in Wenham Neck today, it may have been built by Hampshire himself. It may have been built by Hazard, or by any of the other enslaved people who labored there. Chances are good that they were. Now, one of the last times Hampshire appears in Lieutenant Dodge's account book is March 1776. Hampshire was hired to go to Newbury, probably Newburyport, actually, to pick up a load of lemons. On his way to Newburyport, Hampshire may have noticed 2 beautiful new frigates being built in the shipyards for the fledgling Continental Navy, the frigate Hancock and the frigate Boston, which were being built in Newburyport at the time. Records suggest it wouldn't be the last time Hampshire saw these ships. In two muster rolls for the Continental frigate Boston, one from July 1777 and the other from November 1777, a very unique and familiar name can be found. Come back. There we go. And as you can see, it looks like someone named Hampshire Dodge is on these muster rolls. Could this be Hampshire von Wenham Neck? It wasn't the first time a person enslaved by the Dodges joined the Revolution using the Dodge surname. A man named Scipio Dodge enlisted in May 1775 and joined his owner, Captain Richard Dodge Jr.'s company outside of Boston. And Captain Richard Dodge was the son of our Lieutenant Dodge that we're talking about today. So if it is Hampshire from Wenham Neck in these crew lists, he had a very memorable experience on the frigate. He was assigned to the crew of gun number 10. The ship, in company with the Hancock, the other frigate that was built in Newburyport, saw action in the Gulf of Maine in the late spring of 1777, and they captured several prizes, several prize ships. Early in July, however, the Boston, which in this picture is on the far left-hand side, and the Hancock is in the middle, in between the two British ships. Early in July, the Boston and the Hancock engaged three British naval vessels, HMS Flora, HMS Victor, and HMS Rainbow. Completely outgunned, the Boston's captain, Hector McNeil, broke away from the fray and made for the Sheepscot River in Maine, where they languished and waited for the better part of a month before sailing home again, apparently becalmed. While the Boston remained in the Sheepscot River, the Hancock was captured by the British. And for his decision not to aid the Hancock and instead go up the river, Captain McNeil was court-martialed when they got back. So Hampshire, if it was indeed him listed on these muster rolls, would have experienced all of this firsthand, including the several pitched gun battles at sea. If he'd sailed on the frigate Boston, Hampshire likely returned to Wenham Neck late in 1777. He was a sailor now and a veteran of the Revolutionary War, but a great change was taking place at the Dodge farm as well, the kind of change every enslaved person learned to dread. On April 20th, 1778, the ailing 75-year-old Lieutenant Richard Dodge made his will, signing it with an uncharacteristically shaky hand. And on May 11th, he was dead. With the reading of Lieutenant Dodge's will, any hopes that Hampshire might have harbored about gaining his freedom were dashed. Instead, Lieutenant Dodge transferred ownership of Hampshire to his eldest son, Captain Richard Dodge Jr., also a veteran of the Revolutionary War. In the same will, two other enslaved people were gifted by a stroke of the pen to Lieutenant Dodge's wife, Mary, and those people were Sylvie and her child. These two enslaved people, Sylvie and her child, appear nowhere else that I've been able to find in the Wenham records except this probate packet. So who were they? Was Sylvie Hampshire's partner? Was the child their child? The will gives us absolutely no clues about their relationship to Hampshire. Now, in the inventory of Lieutenant Dodge's estate, in which all of his possessions were categorically listed, which was taken December 15th, 1778. So almost 9 months go by between the death of Dodge and his inventory being taken. Hampshire, Sylvie, and the child actually appear one more time, but they're very anonymously reported here. They are simply one Negro man worth 20 pounds and one Negro woman and child worth 30 pounds. That's it. And beyond this record, I've not been able to find any further trace of Hampshire, Sylvie, or that little child. And so the story of the family of Hazard, Flora, and Hampshire, for the moment, ends as Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. says in the public television program, Finding Your Roots, the paper trail has run out. I am optimistic, though, that as researchers and citizen historians continue to examine Massachusetts archives and archives all over New England, that more and more stories of enslaved people will come to light. They will be unforgotten. If we look carefully enough, we can see traces of their history around us, even today, sometimes in the unlikeliest of places. For example, those of you who are in attendance today, around us here in Burnham Hall are the beams and the beautiful OG braces, those curving braces, recovered from the third Wenham Meeting House, which stood in Wenham from 1688 to 1748. It was a meeting house for 60 years, and these wooden beams and the braces were part of it. Beneath these beams and these braces, the enslaved of Wenham gathered in the meeting house and worshiped. And from the church records, here are some of their names. Primus, enslaved by Mary Q. Warfer, enslaved by Thomas Tarbox. Pompey, enslaved by Josiah Fairfield. Sharper, enslaved by Samuel Gott. Diana, enslaved by Ruth Patch. Adam, enslaved by Jacob Dodge. Jenny, enslaved by Josiah Dodge. Jack, enslaved by William Dodge. And Manning and Abaya, enslaved by Lieutenant Richard Dodge at Wenham Neck, who were baptized and owned the covenant underneath these beams in 1742. There are so many stories to uncover about the enslaved Black community in 18th century Wenham, about the women and the men and the children who lived and labored and loved and worshiped here while in bondage. And the Dodge account books here at the Wenham Museum are just beginning to reveal some of those stories. It is my great privilege to continue this work, and I will keep you updated with what I find. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes. Right, that's a great question. Thank you. So the question was, did the enslaved in Wenham worship at the same time as the white people did? And they actually did. They would have been in a separate part of the meeting house. In the fancier Wenham meeting houses, they had their own pew set aside for them. In some of the meeting houses in Maine, there's actually a gallery where the enslaved would worship, so up above everybody else. But they would have been there at the same time as the people that enslaved them were worshiping. Yes, yes, you have a question?
In Wenham, I'm assuming you have the old burial grounds like other communities do.
Yes.
Were there the graves of the slave people, were those marked? Was there any indication that the slaves that people talk about today are burial grounds?
Thank you for that question. So the question was, were the enslaved buried in the same burying ground that other Wenham residents were buried in? And we have the Wenham burying ground is beautiful. It's on 1A. You pass it as you come here, if you're coming up from the south. No, from what I can tell. And the burying grounds for the enslaved in Wenham have been kind of a topic of question for many, many years. There are, what I want to say, sort of folk memories of there being a burying ground for the enslaved at sort of the four corners of Wenham Neck. So where Larch Row and Walnut, I think, and Dodges Row and Grapevine meet around that area, there were suggestions that the enslaved were buried in that area because the Dodges owned essentially all of that. So I would expect that Hampshire, if he died in Wenham, we don't know, would have been buried there. Flora certainly in that area, but we're not totally sure where that would be today. It's a very sort of heavily occupied area today by houses and gardens and that sort of thing.
It was practiced in some places in the Northeast that enslavers would create, in many cases, quite elaborate and lovely stones to memorialize the people that they enslaved. But this was not universally true. It's very practiced in Newport, Rhode Island. There's 2 acres of the Central Cemetery in Newport, Rhode Island that is dedicated to the graves of enslaved people. And there seems to have been an interesting kind of one-upmanship of the stones that were made for these enslaved people. From one family to the other. No last names are on the stones, but they are described as beloved servant of John Doe and Susan Smith. But the stones themselves are very, very fancy. But this seems to have been a phenomenon largely in Rhode Island and not so much here in Massachusetts. There are rumors, and Jamie and I have plans to take a walk out to the Dodge Family Cemetery, which is near the tree farm in Beverly, to see if any of those rumors are true, if we can look around the edges. The weather hasn't been conducive, life gets in the way, but I have been to that cemetery myself and did not note that there were any enslaved people. You can normally tell if you're in a old cemetery yourself and you notice that there's a name on a grave that doesn't include a surname. Generally speaking, you can assume that that is an enslaved person. But it's sort of, we don't know. There are rumors, there are folk stories, but we just don't know for sure. So sorry to interrupt.
No worries. For those of you who are online and may not have heard that, Jane was just mentioning that in other communities, for example, Newport, Rhode Island.
Newport, Rhode Island. It's well worth, if you're interested in old gravestones, it's worth going down to see. It's really interesting.
So that in Newport, Rhode Island, for example, the enslaved actually were buried in cemeteries right next to their enslavers and with very elaborate headstones. We don't see that in Wenham. Although Jane was just mentioning that she and I, one of these days, will take a hike out to the Dodge Family Cemetery and see what we can find. Yeah. So does anybody else have another question? Yes, VJ.
Are any of the homes where some of these enslaved are still standing, like Dodge Row?
Right. VJ asked a question about architecture again. So the question for those of you online was whether or not any of the homes in which the enslaved lived on in Wenham Neck are still standing. I knew someone was going to ask this question. The Dodges owned a lot of property, and the property changed hands so many times that it was oh, wait a minute. Oh, hang on. I think Robbie Corcoran may have an idea about this.
Yeah, I'm Robbie Corcoran. Jamie and I have been talking about this topic for about a while now. Near as I can tell, so far, there's only one house that is still standing where the slave person lived. It's the house where I live. I'm still looking though to sorry, there's a second one too. The Dr. Fairfield house.
Yeah.
Okay. Across the cemetery, there's a Canberra roof house. That's by Dr. Glenn Fairfield. There are a couple of enslaved people in that house.
Okay.
There's one in mine. And since we're talking about architecture, there's a tiny room in the attic of our house that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Now, Poppy might have lived in a barn, but if you didn't live in the barn, if you lived in the house, the logical place for it would be this very unusual room under the attic.
That was very common.
folks online were talking about a few of the still existent houses in Wenham that enslaved people might have lived in, and particularly talking about the places in the house where they may have lived. So the attic, possibly other outbuildings, but mostly the attic. Yeah, I saw your hand up over there in the back.
From my house, from Wallstown, there is a Dodge house.
Oh.
House.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Similar, and I'm pretty sure my walls are the walls you're talking about.
Oh, wow.
Property that built that on Dodge Road.
So we have another audience member who lives on Dodge's Row and may have owned one of the Dodge houses. Very exciting. And the audience, yes. Another question.
What was their, was all of their, income local, or did they have any connections and shipping connections?
That is such a great question. So the question was, did the Dodges make their money locally, or did they have connections to the West Indies? Yeah. I have pondered this too. There occasionally Lieutenant Richard Dodge somehow acquires things like rum and molasses to sell to people. And I can't imagine that how you would get that in Wenham without connections to the West Indies. And I feel like he had accounts with people like the Lees in Marblehead and Manchester. So yes, I believe that he did have connections to the West Indies. He wasn't a ship owner, Lieutenant Dodge, but there were so many Dodges that probably some of them were, yes. So yes is the answer to that. Does anyone, oh, you have a question over there? Yes.
As odd as I am, as the work required to transcribe books, I'm going to ask you if you've done anything else, which is, have you looked at some of the other towns in the surrounding area for some of the people that you can no longer find records of? Because I know, for example, on Topsail, we had enslaved people in Topsail who were married to enslaved people in Wenham.
Yes.
And it's you know,
Sure.
So
The question is, have I looked at the records of any of the other towns around here? Because for records of the enslaved, yes, not as thoroughly as I would like to, mostly online, just because, pandemic. But you're absolutely right that people were moving back and forth over town lines as if they weren't any bother at all. That will be, I think, as this project grows, that will be something that I take a look at. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Does anyone else have? Oh, there's a question over here on this side. Yes. The question was, do I know, based on the records, how long the Dodge family enslaved people? The family that we talked about today. So Richard, his brother Jacob, and his son, Richard Jr. In that group, Jacob Dodge, Captain Jacob Dodge, dies in 1793. And a wild thing happens with his inventory. So the inventory of all of his possessions that are taken after he dies. At the bottom of his inventory, there are two lines that are crossed out very blackly with ink. And of course, that made me go, oh, what's under there? So I messed around with it a bit with the levels, and I discovered that underneath those two lines in his inventory were blacked out an inventory line for a little black boy of 5 years of age and a black boy 17 years of age. And they were listed in the inventory because even in 1793, the people that were taking this inventory believed that these two little boys were enslaved by Jacob Dodge, even though slavery had ostensibly ended in Massachusetts in 10 years before, 1783. So I believe that Jacob Dodge was enslaving people up until 1793. And then I suppose when the inventory went to court, the judge was like, we don't enslave people anymore. Get rid of that on the inventory. We're not doing this anymore. Jacob. So 1793 for the group of people that we talked about today. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's just about 1 o'clock. Those of you online who stuck around, I really appreciate you coming today too. If anybody has any further questions, you can email me at Tanzer, Tanzer at Bowdoin, BOWDOIN.edu. And I'd be happy to converse with you there. Thank you so much, Wenham Museum. Thank you folks today. Thank you, everyone.